The road north ended where the last lamp post stood. Beyond it, there was only the dark and the frozen ground and the specific, absolute quality of sub-zero air that does not move but simply is, present in every breath, every exposed inch of skin, every surface that the cold has claimed for its own and will not release until spring decides to come back. Senna walked past the lamp post without slowing. She carried one pack. Everything she was permitted to carry under the decree's provisions fit inside it without difficulty, which told her something about what the decree's authors thought she owned that was worth keeping. She did not look back at the settlement lights. She had looked back once, from the edge of town, and had seen what she expected. Windows lit from inside, people going about their evening business. The ordinary activity of a community continuing after one of its members had been removed from it the way you remove a stone from a path, without ceremony, without pause. The northern wastes opened ahead of her, vast and frozen and lit by starlight on snow, which produced a specific quality of blue-white illumination that she had always found, privately, more honest than lamplight. It showed everything as it was. It did not warm what it touched. It simply made it visible. She walked for 2 hours. She found the place she was looking for, a natural elevation, a frozen rise in the landscape, and she stopped. She set down her pack. She knelt on the ice. She leaned close to the frozen ground, close enough that her breath fogged against its surface. And she did something she had not done where anyone could see her in 20 years. She whispered, "Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I'd love to know how far this story reaches." Ashfield was the kind of town that worked. Not beautifully, not generously, not with the particular warmth of a community that had decided to take care of its members beyond the minimum required, but functionally, with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a northern settlement that understood that winter was not a metaphor and that the business of surviving it required everyone to do their part and ask for nothing beyond what their part entitled them to. Senna had been doing her part for 7 years. Her official designation was building assessor, a position she had obtained by passing the kingdom's structural certification examination with the highest score recorded in the Northern Territories in 11 years, and had held by producing assessments that were accurate, thorough, and unfailingly correct in their structural conclusions. In 7 years, she had not issued a single report that required revision. She had not missed a deadline. She had not, in the precise language of her annual performance evaluations, given her supervisors any cause for concern. She had given them no cause for anything, which was the point. Her work was as follows. She visited buildings, residential structures, commercial buildings, the occasional public facility, and she assessed them for structural integrity. She walked their foundations and measured their load distribution and tested their joints and produced written reports that told the administrative office what was sound and what required attention and what was, in her carefully professional language, a liability waiting to happen. She had a gift for seeing the truth of a structure. Everyone who worked with her understood this. No one examined it too closely, because the conclusions it produced were useful and the mechanism behind it was easier not to investigate. She lived in a room on the 2nd floor of a boarding house on Ashfield's eastern edge. The room was adequate, a desk, a cot, a window that faced north and therefore received no direct sunlight, which she did not mind because she had never minded the specific quality of northern light, the way it came at an angle and showed things precisely rather than warmly. She kept the room in the organized, economical way of someone who has learned to take up exactly as much space as the situation permits and no more. Her neighbors in the boarding house were a middle-aged beta couple on the floor below and a young pack-affiliated Omega woman on the same floor, whose name was Dara, and who left baked goods outside Senna's door on cold mornings with no note and no explanation, which Senna appreciated in the specific way she appreciated all things that were offered without requiring acknowledgement. There were 2 other unaffiliated Omegas in Ashfield. She knew their names, Petra and Moss, and their situations with the careful, private attention of someone who understood that knowing the people in your specific category of vulnerability was not paranoia but structural awareness. Petra worked in the textile processing facility. Moss did seasonal labor at the Northern Freight Depot. Both of them had been in Ashfield longer than she had. Both of them had received the same notice she had. The decree arrived on a Tuesday. It was posted at the Community Assembly Hall on a white sheet of official paper with the royal seal at the top. And it was written in the formal language of administrative decree, the language that sounds like water and moves like stone, covering every surface evenly without warmth and without malice. Simply because warmth and malice are not structural requirements of the form. Senna read it at the Assembly Hall with the focused, methodical attention she brought to all documents that required accurate comprehension. She read it twice. She identified the load-bearing elements: unaffiliated Omega designation, Northern Territory, housing rights, effective in 48 hours. She identified the failure points: no appeal mechanism, no grace period beyond the 48 hours, no provision for winter conditions, no acknowledgement in any section of the document that the temperature north of Ashfield was currently 40 below and that the nearest unaffected settlement was 3 days' walk. She identified the absence of any repair. She walked back to her room. She sat at her desk for 1 hour, which was the time she allowed herself for the kind of thinking that the situation required and that she would not allow herself to perform in front of anyone. Then she stood up. She went to the storage chest under her cot and removed the single pack she kept there, a habit she had developed years ago. The specific habit of a person who has always understood at some level that the notice might come, and has therefore always been, in the quietest and most private of ways, ready. She packed with the economy of someone who has thought about this exact sequence before and knows exactly what is necessary and what is not. Her structural assessment tools, because they were hers and because they were useful. Her father's compass, because it was her father's. 3 days of preserved food. 2 changes of clothing. The small notebook she had been filling since she was 8 years old with structural diagrams of things she had built in private and dismantled before morning. She stood in her room and looked at what remained on the desk: the current assessment files, the administrative correspondence, the 7 years of careful, accurate, invisible work represented in paper and ink on the surface of a desk she had rented and would no longer be renting in 42 hours. She left a note for Dara on the floor outside her door. The note said, "Thank you for the bread. It was always good." She stepped out into the winter night. She looked north. The place she had chosen was a frozen rise approximately 9 miles north of Ashfield's last lamp post, at a position she had identified during 7 years of structural assessments as the most advantageous natural elevation in the Northern Territory, defensible on 3 sides by the geography of the frozen landscape. Positioned at the exact point where the northern wind changed direction and could be used rather than endured. Sitting above a deep aquifer whose frozen surface would provide unlimited building material. She had been noting this position in her private notebook for 4 years. She had never written down why. She knelt on the ice at the rise's highest point and pressed her palms flat against the frozen surface and felt the specific quality of this particular ice: deep, dense, crystalline to a depth she could sense through her hands the way a physician senses a pulse. The lattice running clean and uninterrupted far below the surface. Good material. The best she had encountered in the Northern Territory. She leaned close. She whispered. The first whisper was always like that, the first note of something that had been waiting to begin. The ice under her hands warmed fractionally, not from heat, but from recognition. The crystalline lattice responding to the frequency of her voice the way tuning forks respond to their matching pitch. She felt the response move outward from her palms in a slow, spreading wave. The ice becoming attentive in the specific way of a material that is about to be asked to do something and is ready for the asking. She had known this feeling since she was 6 years old. The memory arrived as it sometimes did when she began to work, unbidden, brief, entirely precise. A winter morning, a frozen puddle outside the schoolhouse, her breath fogging in the cold air. The inexplicable and irresistible impulse to lean close to the puddle's surface and say something to it. She had said, "Up." Not as a command, as an invitation. The ice had risen in a tiny perfect tower, no taller than her 6-year-old hand, with the specific crystalline geometry of something that had been growing in exactly this direction all along and had simply needed someone to ask. She had stared at it for a long time. Then she had knocked it over with her boot. Because some instinct already present at 6 understood that this was not something to leave standing where it could be seen. She was not 6 now. She was not hiding. She was building. The towers came first. She had designed them in her notebook over 4 years, the geometry mapped out in the careful, precise hand of a structural assessor who happened to also be the most knowledgeable ice architect alive. The load distribution calculated, the crystalline growth direction charted. She whispered the towers into existence over the first 12 hours, kneeling at each tower's base and directing the growth upward in the specific, sustained frequency that told the ice not just to rise but to become, to achieve the full structural integrity of a deliberately formed crystalline column, rather than the random accretion of ordinary ice formation. The first tower reached its full height at the 8th hour. She had not looked up while she worked. But when she did, when she finally sat back on her heels and raised her eyes, the tower stood 40 feet above her in the winter dark, the starlight moving through it in the blue-white spectrum of perfectly formed crystal, its structure visible from the outside as a pattern of interlocking geometries that no stone building had ever achieved because stone did not have a grain and ice did. She whispered next. The walls came from the towers outward, growing along the crystalline connections she established between each base. The ice following the geometry she had charted in 4 years of notebook pages with a fidelity that still, after 20 years of working with this gift, produced in her something close to wonder. Not because it was magical. She did not think of it as magical. She thought of it as structural, as the application of a precise understanding of how ice worked to the direction of what ice could do, but because the gap between what she could imagine and what the material could produce, when the two were fully aligned, was so small as to be functionally zero. By the 30th hour the walls were complete. By the 45th the gates, 2 of them, southern and northern, each one a perfect arch of interlocking ice crystal that was stronger than any stone arch she had assessed in 12 years of professional work. By the 60th hour, the inner halls, where the ice's thermal architecture was doing something that no material she had studied in her formal training could do, it was becoming warm. Not from any external heat source, but from the structure itself. The crystalline geometry directing and containing the ambient thermal energy of the 60 bodies that had begun, by this point, to gather outside the southern gate. She had not told anyone. She had not sent word. But the towers were visible from 40 miles in every direction in the Northern Territory. And in the Northern Territory in winter, visible from 40 miles meant something specific: shelter, light, possibility. By the 72nd hour, she was on her knees at the fortress's center, her voice worn to a thread, her body at the edge of everything it had. She looked up at what she had made, the towers and the walls and the gates and the inner halls, the crystalline structure catching the morning light of the 3rd day and returning it as something more than it had been when it arrived, the way all precisely made things do. She breathed. She said, in the last whisper she had before silence took her voice entirely, "Stay." Behind her, from across the frozen landscape, the sound of footsteps in snow, more than one set, more than 2. She did not have to turn to count them. She could feel them through the ice, the way she felt everything that touched the surface she had built. 3 omegas and a juvenile wolf, frostbitten and barely standing, who had been walking for 4 days. The southern gate opened. She had not touched it. The ice had simply understood. The place she had chosen was a frozen rise approximately 9 miles north of Ashfield's last lamp post, at a position she had identified during 7 years of structural assessments as the most advantageous natural elevation in the Northern Territory, defensible on 3 sides by the geography of the frozen landscape, positioned at the exact point where the northern wind changed direction and could be used rather than endured, sitting above a deep aquifer whose frozen surface would provide unlimited building material. She had been noting this position in her private notebook for 4 years. She had never written down why. She knelt on the ice at the rise's highest point and pressed her palms flat against the frozen surface and felt the specific quality of this particular ice, deep, dense, crystalline to a depth she could sense through her hands the way a physician senses a pulse. The lattice running clean and uninterrupted far below the surface. Good material. The best she had encountered in the Northern Territory. She leaned close. She whispered. The first whisper was always like that, the first note of something that had been waiting to begin. The ice under her hands warmed fractionally, not from heat, but from recognition. The crystalline lattice responding to the frequency of her voice the way tuning forks respond to their matching pitch. She felt the response move outward from her palms in a slow, spreading wave. The ice becoming attentive in the specific way of a material that is about to be asked to do something and is ready for the asking. She had known this feeling since she was 6 years old. The memory arrived as it sometimes did when she began to work, unbidden, brief, entirely precise. A winter morning, a frozen puddle outside the schoolhouse, her breath fogging in the cold air. The inexplicable and irresistible impulse to lean close to the puddle's surface and say something to it. She had said, "Up," not as a command, as an invitation. The ice had risen in a tiny perfect tower, no taller than her 6-year-old hand, with the specific crystalline geometry of something that had been growing in exactly this direction all along and had simply needed someone to ask. She had stared at it for a long time. Then she had knocked it over with her boot. Because some instinct already present at 6 understood that this was not something to leave standing where it could be seen. She was not 6 now. She was not hiding. She was building. The towers came first. She had designed them in her notebook over 4 years, the geometry mapped out in the careful, precise hand of a structural assessor who happened to also be the most knowledgeable ice architect alive. The load distribution calculated, the crystalline growth direction charted. She whispered the towers into existence over the first 12 hours, kneeling at each tower's base and directing the growth upward in the specific, sustained frequency that told the ice not just to rise but to become, to achieve the full structural integrity of a deliberately formed crystalline column, rather than the random accretion of ordinary ice formation. The first tower reached its full height at the 8th hour. She had not looked up while she worked. But when she did, when she finally sat back on her heels and raised her eyes, the tower stood 40 feet above her in the winter dark, the starlight moving through it in the blue-white spectrum of perfectly formed crystal, its structure visible from the outside as a pattern of interlocking geometries that no stone building had ever achieved because stone did not have a grain and ice did. She whispered next. The walls came from the towers outward, growing along the crystalline connections she established between each base. The ice following the geometry she had charted in 4 years of notebook pages with a fidelity that still, after 20 years of working with this gift, produced in her something close to wonder. Not because it was magical. She did not think of it as magical. She thought of it as structural, as the application of a precise understanding of how ice worked to the direction of what ice could do, but because the gap between what she could imagine and what the material could produce, when the two were fully aligned, was so small as to be functionally zero. By the 30th hour the walls were complete. By the 45th the gates, 2 of them, southern and northern, each one a perfect arch of interlocking ice crystal that was stronger than any stone arch she had assessed in 12 years of professional work. By the 60th hour, the inner halls, where the ice's thermal architecture was doing something that no material she had studied in her formal training could do, it was becoming warm. Not from any external heat source, but from the structure itself. The crystalline geometry directing and containing the ambient thermal energy of the 60 bodies that had begun, by this point, to gather outside the southern gate. She had not told anyone. She had not sent word. But the towers were visible from 40 miles in every direction in the Northern Territory. And in the Northern Territory in winter, visible from 40 miles meant something specific: shelter, light, possibility. By the 72nd hour, she was on her knees at the fortress's center, her voice worn to a thread, her body at the edge of everything it had. She looked up at what she had made, the towers and the walls and the gates and the inner halls, the crystalline structure catching the morning light of the 3rd day and returning it as something more than it had been when it arrived, the way all precisely made things do. She breathed. She said, in the last whisper she had before silence took her voice entirely, "Stay." Behind her, from across the frozen landscape, the sound of footsteps in snow, more than one set, more than 2. She did not have to turn to count them. She could feel them through the ice, the way she felt everything that touched the surface she had built. 3 omegas and a juvenile wolf, frostbitten and barely standing, who had been walking for 4 days. The southern gate opened. She had not touched it. The ice had simply understood. The first report arrived on a Thursday and described a light on the northern horizon. The patrol officer who filed it had used the word anomalous. which was the professional register for something that did not fit the existing categories, and which the officer had therefore declined to speculate about beyond its factual description. A consistent luminosity visible from the patrol's northern observation point, stationary, present across 3 consecutive night watches. Originating from a position approximately 9 miles north of Ashfield in the open northern wastes where no structure was documented to exist. Calder's intelligence office received it, logged it, and forwarded it to the Northern Territory Administration with a standard inquiry request. He did not see it. The second report arrived 6 days later. It had been filed by a scout sent to investigate the anomalous luminosity. The scout's report was longer than the first, 2 pages, written in the careful, slightly compressed language of someone who has seen something they are not certain their professional vocabulary can adequately contain, and has decided to limit themselves to verifiable facts as a result. The verifiable facts were a structure of unknown construction material, positioned on the natural elevation 9 miles north of Ashfield, consisting of multiple towers and an enclosing wall and 2 gated entrances, producing a quality of light reflection unlike any stone or timber structure in the territory. Visible from a distance the scout estimated at 40 miles under clear winter conditions. Estimated structural footprint, approximately 3 acres. Estimated tower height, 40 feet. Current occupancy, unknown. But the scout had observed figures moving within the structure's interior and smoke rising from what appeared to be an interior fire source. The scout had added, in a single sentence at the report's bottom that was slightly outside the formal register of official documentation, "I do not know what it is made of, but it is the most beautiful thing I have seen in the Northern Territory, and I have been stationed here for 11 years. This report reached Calder's desk. He read it with the focused attention he gave to everything that came from the Northern Territory, which was the attention of a king who understood that the northern border was the kingdom's most vulnerable point, and who had been receiving reports about that vulnerability for the entirety of his reign. He noted the anomalous structure. He requested a follow-up assessment from the Military Engineering Office. The military engineer who made the journey north was a woman named Voss, who had spent 30 years assessing fortifications across the kingdom and who had the reputation of someone who was not given to exaggeration, professional or personal, under any circumstances. Her report was 7 pages long. It arrived on Calder's desk on a Wednesday morning, and he read the first page and then set it down and poured himself a glass of water and then picked it up and read the rest of it without stopping. The structure was ice. Crystalline ice of a formation quality Voss had not encountered in any naturally occurring or artificially constructed form, ice grown along its own crystalline grain rather than shaped by external pressure. Producing a structural integrity, she had tested with a load assessment kit she had brought specifically for the purpose. The results of the load assessment were in an appendix. She had included the appendix with the specific, apologetic thoroughness of someone who understands that the numbers they are about to present will not be believed without full documentation. The ice was, by her measurements, stronger than the kingdom's best quarried stone by a factor she described as significant and then quantified in 3 decimal places. The word impossible appeared 4 times in the report. Voss was not a woman who used words carelessly. Calder read each instance with the attention it deserved. The structure's interior was warm. Voss had confirmed this by the simple method of entering the structure through an open secondary gate and standing in its interior for 20 minutes with a temperature gauge. The interior temperature was equivalent to a well-heated stone building. The exterior temperature had been 42 below. There was no fire source large enough to account for the differential. The warmth, Voss wrote, with the carefully hedged language of a professional confronting something for which her training had not prepared her, appears to originate from the structure itself. The structure's position was the detail that had made Voss add a handwritten note on the final page, outside the report's formal structure, because she felt it required comment that the formal structure of a military assessment was not designed to accommodate. The position, she wrote, is the exact position that the Northern Territory Defense Analysis has been recommending for a permanent fortification installation for the past decade. I have personally contributed to 3 of those analyses. Whatever built this structure positioned it as if it had read those analyses. Calder set the report down. He looked at his intelligence officer, who who had been waiting across the desk with the patient stillness of a man who has been carrying this information for 3 days and has been deciding how to deliver it. Calder said, "Who built it?" His intelligence officer placed a second document on the desk. A list of names, cross-referenced from settlement records, all of them Omega designated. All of them displaced from northern settlements by the Winter Court decree. At the top of the list, a name with 3 annotations: Building Assessor, Certified Structural Examiner, highest Northern Territory certification score in 11 years. Senna. His officer said, the fortress appeared 3 days after the decree's enforcement date in Ashfield. We believe it was built by a single individual over approximately 72 hours. Calder looked at the list. He looked at Voss's report. He looked at the word impossible, for times, in handwriting that had never previously found the word necessary. His military advisor leaned forward. There are currently 43 people living inside that fortress, Your Majesty. The number grows daily. It is, for all practical purposes, a settlement. He paused. He said, it is also, for all military purposes, the most strategically significant structure currently standing in the Northern Territory. And we did not build it. Calder rode north with 12 people and arrived at the fortress with his assumptions about how things worked significantly revised. The revision began at approximately 2 miles out, when the fortress became fully visible on the horizon, and his chief engineer, a methodical man named Bren who had spent 25 years building things for the kingdom and who had read Voss's report twice with the focused skepticism of a professional confronting a colleague's conclusions he found difficult to credit, went completely silent. Not the silence of someone managing a reaction. The silence of someone who has stopped managing because the scale of what they are looking at has exceeded the capacity of management. Bren said nothing for the remaining 2 miles. He looked at the fortress the entire time with the specific, total attention of someone who has spent a quarter-century understanding how structures work and has just encountered one that appears to work according to principles he does not fully possess. Calder watched him and said nothing. The fortress at close range was different from the fortress at distance in the way that all precisely made things are different at close range. Not smaller, not less impressive, but more specific. The crystalline structure of the walls was visible as a pattern of interlocking geometries that became more complex the closer you came. Each individual crystal in a precisely determined relationship to the ones around it. The aggregate producing a structural coherence that Bren was clearly doing rapid, involuntary calculations about because his lips were moving slightly as he looked at it. The gates were closed. Calder observed this fact and waited for its implications to catch up with his expectations, which took a moment because the implications were that the gates were not going to open simply because he had arrived, which was not something his expectations had included as a live possibility. He sent a guard to knock. The guard knocked. The gates did not open. He sent his diplomatic official to announce his presence and formally request an audience. The diplomatic official approached the gate and delivered his announcement in the practiced, resonant voice of someone who had been announcing the king's presence in formal settings for 16 years and had never previously had to wonder whether the announcement would produce the expected result. The gate did not open. After a pause of approximately 2 minutes, a small panel at eye level slid back, a window the size of a hand, precisely cut, framed in a crystalline molding that Bren stared at with the intensity of someone encountering a detail that has just revised his understanding of the whole. A pair of eyes appeared in the opening. Dark eyes. Alert, assessing, carrying the focused quality of someone who was currently evaluating the information in front of her with professional, rather than emotional attention. A voice came through the panel, low even, with the specific quality of a voice accustomed to being its own authority, rather than borrowed from someone else's. It said, "State your purpose." Calder's diplomatic official stated his purpose in the formal language of official announcement. There was a pause. The panel closed. They waited. Calder's senior military advisor shifted in his saddle with the discomfort of a man who had organized his entire professional understanding around the principle that military authority produced immediate results and was currently finding that principle under significant revision. Calder sat very still and did not communicate impatience because he did not, he was discovering, feel impatience. He felt something more like attention, the specific, focused quality of a situation that was teaching him something, and that he was paying close enough attention to actually learn it. 20 minutes.
Welcome back to our channel. Today Mott V brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
The panel opened again. The same eyes. The same voice. The voice said, "You may enter." 3 people. His diplomatic official began to explain that the royal party numbered 12, and that protocol required a minimum company of. The panel closed. A longer pause. Then with the deep, architectural sound of a structure that was entirely secure in its own construction, and was choosing to open rather than being opened, the gates moved. Slowly, with the specific, unhurried quality of something that had been designed to move at exactly this pace, and was not going to be rushed. She stood inside them. She was not what Calder had built from the intelligence reports. He had been building her from the evidence of what she had done, which had produced, inevitably, something large and abstract. The person inside the gates was specific. She was perhaps 30, with the focused stillness of someone accustomed to working in isolation, wearing practical northern clothing that was entirely adequate for the temperature and made no other statement. She looked at him with the direct, professional attention of a structural assessor evaluating something for load-bearing capacity. Not deference. Not defiance, simply the honest assessment of something she needed to understand accurately. She looked at the company of 12 behind him. She looked back at him. 3, she said. His military advisor made a sound beside him. Calder did not look at the military advisor. He dismounted. He chose his military advisor and Bren, and left the remaining 10 outside with instructions that were unnecessary because the gates were already beginning to close. He stepped inside. The gates closed behind him with the same unhurried certainty with which they had opened, and in the sudden crystalline quiet of the fortress interior, Calder understood something that the intelligence reports had gestured toward, but not fully communicated. He was inside a structure he had not built, had not authorized, and could not leave without the permission of the woman standing 3 feet in front of him. He had not been in this position in his adult life. He found, to his own surprise, that he was not going to waste it. The warmth arrived first. Not gradually, not as the body's adjustment to a change in temperature, but immediately, a distinct, ambient warmth that had no visible source and no logical explanation, and that Bren registered by stopping walking entirely for a full 3 seconds and looking at the walls with the expression of a man whose professional understanding has just been asked to accommodate something it was not built to hold. He said in the low, involuntary voice of someone thinking aloud rather than speaking deliberately, "The thermal differential should not be sustainable without an active heat source of significant capacity." Senna said, without looking at him, "I know." She led them through the main courtyard at the pace of someone conducting a professional walkthrough, not a tour, not a performance. Simply the systematic movement through a space of someone who knows it completely and is giving others the information they need to understand what they are looking at. The courtyard was large, occupying the fortress's central area, with the towers at its 4 cardinal points and the inner halls opening off its edges. The light inside was not the diffuse gray of overcast northern sky, but something more specific. The crystalline walls were transmitting and refracting the exterior light in a way that produced a quality of illumination that was both brighter and softer than anything Calder had encountered in stone architecture, as if the light itself had been organized by the structure it passed through. The settlement's residents went about their work. 53 people, he counted without appearing to count. As was his habit, occupying the space with the purposeful, quiet efficiency of a community that has established its rhythms and is operating within them. A woman was repairing clothing near one of the inner hall entrances. A group of 4 were processing food near a centrally positioned fire that was smaller than any fire that could be responsible for the warmth in the space. 3 children were chasing each other across the courtyard with the specific, absolute focus of children who have found a place where they feel safe enough to run. Bren had produced a notebook and was writing in it with the concentrated intensity of someone who understands that he is going to need a record of what he is seeing, because his memory, however professional, was not designed for information at this density. He asked Senna a question about the wall composition. She answered with the precision of a structural assessor who has also built the structure in question, the specific crystalline geometry, the growth direction, the load distribution. Bren wrote. He asked another question. She answered. This continued as they moved through the space. A professional exchange between two people who shared a technical language and were using it to discuss something only one of them had built. Calder asked no questions. He watched and listened and stored. The inner hall she brought them to last was the largest, the main gathering space. Its ceiling the highest in the fortress, its walls the thickest. The crystalline structure at its most elaborate in the specific way of a section of a building where the architect has allowed herself the full expression of what the material can do. The light here was extraordinary. It moved through the walls in a way that made the space feel, in the quiet of a northern winter morning, genuinely alive, not the decorative aliveness of deliberately beautiful architecture, but the more fundamental aliveness of something that had grown rather than been assembled. They stood in the main hall. Bren was still writing. Calder looked at Senna. He said, I need to ask you something. She said, I know. He said, why did you build it here? He met the question practically. As a military and strategic inquiry, why this specific position in the northern wastes? 9 miles north of Ashfield, at this precise elevation. She said, because this is where it needed to be. He said, this is also the exact position my military analysts have been recommending for northern border fortification for a decade. She said, I know. She paused. She said, I wrote 3 of those assessments. He looked at her. He said, you were a building assessor in Ashfield. She said, I was the building assessor in Ashfield. For 7 years. The assessments that recommended this position are in the Northern Territory Administrative Archive. Under my certification number, if you want to verify the attribution. He was quiet for a moment. He said, you designed the fortification you were eventually going to build. She said, I designed the fortification that needed to be built, and that no one with the authority to build it had built. Then your decree gave me the time, and the reason, and the absence of other obligations. She said it without bitterness, not managed bitterness, actually absent. In the specific way of a statement of fact from someone who has already moved past the emotion and into the action. Bren looked up from his notebook. He said, to no one in particular, but in the direction of the wall nearest him. The load distribution in this wall is more sophisticated than anything I have built in 25 years. He said it with the plain, professional honesty of someone for whom accuracy superseded ego. He said, I would like to understand how it was done. Senna looked at him. She said, I can show you. It is not complicated once you understand what the material wants to do. Bren said, in my experience, ice wants to crack. She said, in my experience, ice wants to hold. You simply have to ask it correctly. His military advisor, who had been conducting his own assessment of the space with the focused attention of a man calculating military capacity, leaned close to Calder. He said quietly, this fortress, in its current position, with its current structural specifications, would have prevented last winter's northern incursion entirely. He paused. He said, 47 soldiers died in that incursion. He read the welfare assessment on a Sunday night. It had been in the decree's administrative file the entire time, attached as the 3rd document in a packet of 7. Behind the resource allocation analysis and the housing inventory summary, and before the legal framework review and the 3 supporting appendices. It was 11 pages long. It had been authored by a senior policy analyst named Weld, who had the specific, careful writing style of someone who has spent a career delivering information that powerful people find inconvenient and has developed, as a result, a professional register that is simultaneously honest and survivable. Calder had signed the decree during the 4th hour of a 6-hour council session. He had read the summary, 3 sentences, accurate as far as they went, covering approximately 12% of what the welfare assessment contained. He had signed. He had moved to the next item. He read the assessment now in its entirety, with the full attention it had deserved then and had not received. The assessment was precise in the way that honest documents about human welfare are precise when their authors have decided that precision is more important than palatability. Weld had documented the affected population with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that numbers were people, and that losing the people inside the numbers was a specific kind of professional failure he was not going to commit. 3,214 Omega-designated citizens in the Northern Territories would lose housing rights under the decree. Of those, approximately 400 had no documented PAC affiliation. Of those 400, approximately 160 were located in settlements north of the Ashfield line, where the nearest unaffected settlement was more than 3 days' walk. Weld had written on page 7, in a sentence that was the assessment's most precise and most professionally courageous moment. Survival outcomes for displaced individuals in the Ashfield North category during winter conditions are not favorable without immediate alternative shelter provision. Not favorable. Calder read the sentence 3 times. He understood, with the clarity of someone who has worked in governance long enough to learn the translation table between official language and direct language, that not favorable meant not likely to survive. That the sentence was describing people who would walk into sub-zero northern wastes in winter with nowhere to go and would not come back from it. He turned to page 9. Weld had included a recommendation. A phased implementation timeline allowing affected individuals to make alternative arrangements before the effective date, combined with a temporary shelter provision in the northern settlements for those without PAC affiliation options. The recommendation had been noted in the Council's deliberation minutes. It had not been included in the decree. Calder set the assessment down. He sat at his desk in the specific quality of a late Sunday night silence and did the accounting that he had been managing, in various forms and with varying degrees of honesty, since Voss's report had arrived on his desk 2 weeks prior. He had signed a document that he had not read. He had signed it in the 4th hour of a long session on the basis of a 3-sentence summary, without asking whether the 7 attached documents contained anything that required his attention. He had done this because the decree had been presented to him as a resource allocation measure, technical, administrative. The kind of governance business that did not require the King's direct engagement because it had been properly vetted by the appropriate professional staff. He had trusted the framing rather than the evidence. The evidence on page 7 said not favorable. He went to the fortress the following week. He rode alone, one guard who waited at the gates. He had not sent advance word. She received him in the main hall with the same even assessing attention she gave to everything he brought to that room, which by now he understood was simply how she engaged with the world and was not calibrated to him specifically, which he found strangely more valuable than a response that was. He sat across from her. He said, "I read the welfare assessment that was attached to the decree when it came to me for signature." She looked at him. She waited. He said, "I did not read it before I signed. I read a 3-sentence summary, and I signed the decree, and I moved to the next item on the session agenda." She said nothing. He had learned that her silences were not absences. They were the space she gave to things that needed to be received completely before they were responded to. He said, "The assessment described survival outcomes for the Ashfield North population as not favorable in winter conditions without alternative shelter. I understand what that language means in practice." She said, 2 people did not survive. In Verrett, north of the Ashfield line, before the word of the fortress spread far enough to reach them. The main hall was very quiet around those words. The crystalline walls held the silence with the same structural completeness with which they held everything, without adding to it, without softening it, simply containing it at full weight. He sat with the specific, personal gravity of 2 deaths that his signature had produced. He did not reach for mitigation. He did not construct the context that would make the weight more bearable. He had decided, somewhere on the road between the capital and the fortress, that he was going to hold this without managing it, because managing it was what he had done before, and managing it was what had made not reading a welfare assessment feel like an acceptable choice in the 4th hour of a long session. He held it. It was very heavy. He held it anyway. The capital was quiet at the 3rd bell of the night, and Calder was at his desk. This was not unusual in the structural sense. He worked late regularly, with the disciplined consistency of a king who understood that governance did not complete itself and who had organized his habits accordingly. What was unusual was the quality of the work. He was not reviewing correspondence or signing orders or reading the intelligence summaries that arrived from the Northern and Eastern Territories with the steady, professional regularity of a system that was functioning as designed. He was doing something his desk had not been used for in a long time, perhaps not ever. He was looking at a thing without looking for the path through it. The welfare assessment was open in front of him. Not because he needed to read it again. He had read it 4 times now and had reached the point where he could reconstruct page 7 from memory, including the sentence whose official language he had translated into the direct language of what it actually meant and had not been able to subsequently translate back. He had it open because having it present while he thought about it was more honest than putting it away, and he had been trying, with the specific and effortful intention of someone learning a new practice, to be more honest than he had been. He had been working on the accounting for 6 hours. The accounting was not of the decree specifically. He had a full administrative review underway, staffed by people who were better equipped to assess the policy mechanism's failures than he was, and who would produce a thorough report within the week. The accounting he was conducting was personal and had no staff and no report format and no precedent in his 17 years of governance, because he had not previously found it necessary to account for himself to himself in this particular way. He had been a king since he was 22. He had signed thousands of documents. He had read the summaries and approved the measures and managed the kingdom with the brisk, forward-looking efficiency of someone who understood that governance required decisive action, and that decisive action required the ability to process information at a rate that did not allow for extended deliberation on each item. He had been good at this. The kingdom had been, by the measurable standards of territorial security and economic stability and political coherence, well governed. He thought about page 7 of the welfare assessment. He thought about not favorable. He thought about the 3-sentence summary he had read instead, and the specific cognitive comfort of a summary, the way a summary resolved complexity into actionability, reduced the difficult texture of reality into the smooth, handleable form of a decision point. He thought about how many summaries he had acted on, how many page 7s he had not read. He thought about 47 soldiers in last winter's northern incursion. He had read that report in full, every page, every detail, every name. He had read it because soldiers were his direct responsibility in the specific way that his governance training had made salient. His command, his loss, his obligation to understand completely. He had not read the welfare assessment with the same completeness because Omega housing rights in the Northern Territory had not been categorized in his governance training or his governance practice as his direct responsibility in the same way. This was the center of the accounting, not the signature. The signature was the moment of the failure, not its cause. The cause was a categorization, a quiet, untested, foundational assumption that certain kinds of harm were not in the category of things that required his full attention, because the people they happened to were not in the category of people whose losses were counted the way soldiers' losses were counted. He thought about Senna in the northern wastes for 72 hours, building something that his kingdom had needed for a decade and had not built, alone in the sub-zero dark, because his decree had given her nothing else to do with herself. He thought about 2 deaths in Verret, 2 people whose names he did not yet know, and was going to find out and was going to know. He picked up his pen. The first letter was formal, a notice to the council, written in the precise language of royal directive, informing them that the Winter Court decree was suspended pending a full welfare review, and that no enforcement actions were to be taken against any currently displaced individual until the review's completion. He wrote it clearly and without qualification, because qualification was how things that should be done without condition acquired the conditions that eventually prevented them. The second letter was not addressed to the council. He had been composing it in his head for the past hour and was still not certain of the register. Not formal, not casual, something more direct than either. He wrote it in the plain language he used when plain language was the only honest option. He addressed it to the fortress. He sealed both letters. His chief advisor arrived at dawn with the expression of a man who has been doing his own accounting and has not enjoyed the process. 3 senior council members, he said, anticipating the decree's suspension, had filed a formal objection citing the resource allocation rationale and requesting an emergency council session to prevent unilateral reversal of approved legislation. Calder looked at the sealed letters on his desk. He looked at his advisor. He said, "Schedule the session, and send both of those letters before it begins." The third visit had a different quality than the first two. Senna recognized it in the specific way she recognized structural changes in a building, not from a single indicator, but from the aggregate of small things that had shifted in their relationship to each other. He had ridden alone, which was the first indicator. He had not sent advance word, which by the third visit she no longer found surprising, but still noted as a choice rather than an oversight. He had arrived at the southern gate and knocked himself, without sending a guard ahead, which was new. She had opened the gate herself. They had stood in the threshold for a moment, not awkwardly, but with the specific quality of a pause that contains something neither party has decided how to name yet, and she had said, "Come in." He had come in. They had conducted the settlement's practical business first. There was always practical business now. The fortress's growing population required a corresponding growth in its administrative relationships with the kingdom. And Calder had been navigating those relationships with a directness and a genuine attention to the settlement's actual needs that she had not initially expected, and had been carefully recalibrating her expectations around since. He had arranged for supply routes. He had resolved a jurisdictional question regarding the settlement's residents' legal status with a clarity of decision that had surprised several of his own advisors. He did what he said he was going to do, which was not a quality she had assumed, and was a quality she was finding increasingly difficult to treat as anything other than what it was. When the practical business was finished, he said, "I want to understand how the fortress was built." He had said this before, in various formulations, and she had answered the structural questions each time. This time the question carried a different weight. She could hear it in the specific quality of his directness. The way he was asking for something more particular than structural specifications. She said, "What do you want to understand?" He said, "The mechanism. How you communicate with it." He looked at the wall nearest him, the main hall's eastern wall, the most elaborate section of the fortress's construction. He said, "Bren has been working with my structural team on the principles you described. He says he understands the mathematics. He does not understand the conversation." She considered this for a moment. The word conversation was more accurate than he knew, and the fact that he had reached for it rather than for a more mechanical term told her something she was still deciding what to do with. She said, "Come to the wall." She brought him to a section of the inner wall where the crystalline structure was close enough to touch and complex enough to demonstrate. She crouched beside it, a professional position, the position of a structural assessor at a joint, and he crouched beside her, which she noted because most people of his authority crouched reluctantly, if at all, as if proximity to the ground was a concession. He crouched without apparent thought, simply because the wall was at that level and he wanted to see it. She said, "The grain runs this direction." She indicated it with her finger, tracing the natural growth direction of the crystalline structure without touching it. She said, "Every crystal in this wall is growing in the direction it wanted to grow. I did not impose a direction. I asked it where it was going and helped it get there faster." He studied the wall. He said, "And the asking is the whisper." She said, "The whisper is the frequency that the crystalline lattice responds to. It is not language in the way you and I are using language now. It is more like," she paused, because this was the part she had never successfully translated into conventional terms. She said, "It is more like asking someone to show you what they are already trying to do." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And if you ask it to do something it does not want to do?" She said, "Then it does not respond. Or it responds and then fails. Structures built against the grain fail. Always. Eventually." He looked at the wall for a long time. She recognized the look, not the professional assessment of an engineer studying specifications, but the more personal attention of someone who is receiving a principle and applying it somewhere beyond the immediate context. She said, "You can demonstrate to yourself if you want. Put your hand near the wall. Not touching. Near." He extended his hand, palm toward the wall, fingers slightly open. She leaned close to the ice. She whispered 3 words. A crystal formation grew from the wall toward his hand, slowly, with the deliberate quality of something that was moving in its own time and at its own pace. A branch perhaps 4 inches long, perfectly formed. its facets catching the interior light in the specific way of ice that has been grown rather than cut. He watched it grow. His expression, which she had been learning to read over 3 visits as the expression of a man who was genuinely encountering things rather than processing them for use, changed in the moment the crystal reached its full extension, becoming something more personal than the focused, analytical attention he usually brought. Becoming something she recognized, with a precision she found both accurate and inconvenient, as wonder. He said, "How long have you been able to do this?" She said, "I was 6. He said, "And you have been hiding it since?" She said, "Since 8. She said it without the weight of grievance, not because the grievance was absent, but because she had already used it as building material and it had become something else. He said, "Because it was not safe." She said, "Because Omega gifts are resources until they are registered. And once they are registered, they are no longer yours. They are the Pax or the kingdoms or whoever had the administrative authority to file the claim." She paused. She said, "I was not interested in building a fortress for someone else." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I want to change that. The registration statute. The whole framework." She said, "I know." She looked at the crystal formation on the wall, still there, extending toward where his hand had been. She said, "Saying it and building it are different things." He said, "I know that too." He looked at the crystal, then at her. He said, in the quietest register she had heard from him, "I am trying to learn how to build from the grain." She looked at him with the full, assessing attention she gave to things she needed to understand accurately. She held the assessment for a moment without resolving it into a conclusion, which was unusual for her and which she noted. She said, "Then you need to understand what the grain is." He reached out and touched the crystal she had grown, briefly, carefully, with the specific quality of someone touching something they understand is both strong and precisely made. He said, "Tell me." Lord Harwick had been the kingdom's senior housing advisor for 14 years. In that time he had developed, with the patient accumulation of a professional who understood that institutional longevity required the management of institutional threats, a thorough working knowledge of every procedural mechanism available to the senior counsel when the Crown's policy direction required correction. He had used these mechanisms 11 times in 14 years, with a success rate he considered satisfactory. And he had spent the 10 days since Calder's suspension notice building the 12th application with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this particular situation was the most consequential he had managed and required his best work. The formal challenge had 3 components. The first established the fortress as an unauthorized structure on Crown land. The northern wastes were Crown territory, unmanaged, undeveloped, but legally the kingdom's property under the Northern Territory Charter. A structure of the fortress's scale, built without Crown authorization on Crown land, constituted a violation of the land use statute, regardless of the structure's quality or the circumstances of its construction. The argument was technically airtight. The second established the settlement's residents as trespassers under the existing housing framework. The decree's suspension did not retroactively authorize residents in an unauthorized structure on Crown land. 61 people were currently residing in a building they had no legal right to occupy. This was documented and provable. The third was the most precise and the most dangerous. It invoked the unregistered gift use statute, a law that had existed in the kingdom's legal framework for 60 years and had been used, in various forms, to compel the registration of Omega gifts that had been deployed publicly without prior Crown authorization. The statute carried specific penalties, including a formal assessment process and compulsory registration if the gift was deemed to have significant public impact. The fortress had significant public impact by any measurable standard. The woman who built it had never registered her gift. The statute applied. Harwick presented the challenge in the emergency council session with the professional fluency of someone who had been constructing arguments in this room for 14 years and knew exactly which members of his audience needed which elements emphasized. He was thorough. He was technically correct at every point. He was not, Calder noted from the head of the table, wrong about the legal framework as it currently existed. Calder received the challenge with the specific stillness that had been developing in him over the past weeks, the stillness of someone who has stopped managing their responses and started actually having them. which produced, paradoxically, a greater outward calm. He said, "The challenge will receive a formal response." He adjourned the session. He sent a rider to the fortress before he reached his own study. The rider's message arrived at the fortress in the early evening. Senna read it in the main hall, standing. With the focused attention she brought to all documents that required accurate comprehension. Around her, the settlement's 61 residents were going about the evening's business, preparing food, settling children, conducting the quiet maintenance activities of a community that had established its rhythms. She was aware of the quality of attention they were directing at her without appearing to direct it at her. The peripheral attentiveness of people whose lives were directly connected to what the document in her hands said. She read to the end. She held the document for a moment. She set it down on the table beside her. She said, in the plain voice she used when plain language was the only appropriate register, "Pack nothing. There is nothing in this building that cannot be rebuilt." She looked at the walls around her, the crystalline structure, warm and luminous, holding 61 people in the specific safety of something that had been built from the truth of its material. She said, "The challenge is based on laws as they currently exist. Laws change." She paused. Then she said, "Tell the king I will come to the capital when he is ready to have a real conversation. Not a council hearing. A real one." She said it without heat. She said it with the plain, structural precision of a woman who had been doing assessments long enough to know the difference between a problem that required procedural management and a problem that required someone to look at the load-bearing elements and tell the truth about what was holding and what was not. She turned to the youngest of the settlement's residents, a 14-year-old girl named Fun, the daughter of one of the first 3 Omegas who had come through the gate, and said, "The fortress stands. You are safe tonight." Fun nodded with the solemn trust of someone who has been told a thing by the person who built everything they can currently see and has decided that trust is the appropriate response. The rider returned to the capital with Senna's message. Calder read it in his study, standing, because he had been sitting all day, and the message had arrived at an hour when sitting was the wrong physical register for receiving it. He read it twice. He looked at the window, which showed him the capital's evening business, which continued in its indifferent way. "Name your terms," he sent back. 4 words. He looked at them before sealing the letter and understood that they were the most complete reversal of the standard dynamic between a king and a subject that he had produced in 17 years of governance, and that they were the correct response, and that the correctness of them was the most honest thing he had felt about a decision in a long time. He sealed the letter. He sent the rider. He went to the window and looked north, where the fortress was too far away to see, but was there regardless. Luminous and crystalline and warm inside despite the 40 below exterior. Holding 61 people who were alive because a woman he had rendered homeless had decided to build something instead of disappearing. He rode to the fortress that evening instead of waiting for her to come to the capital. She had not expected this, or rather, she had considered it as a possibility and assigned it a lower probability than his sending a formal diplomatic delegation. Because sending a formal delegation was what kings did when they wanted to negotiate, and she had framed her message as a negotiation. She revised her probability assessment when she heard the gate signal and looked through the panel and found him standing alone in the winter dark without a company, without diplomatic officials, without the apparatus of official business. One guard, waiting at a distance that suggested Calder had instructed him to wait at a distance rather than at his shoulder. She opened the gate herself. He came in without the 20-minute wait, which she registered as the gate's assessment of the situation rather than her own. Because the gate had learned, in 11 weeks of operation, to read the quality of what arrived at it with a precision she had not specifically designed, but which did not surprise her. The ice always knew. He followed her to the upper planning room, without asking where they were going, which meant he had been paying attention on the previous visits and had noted where she worked. She had noted that he was the kind of person who paid that quality of attention and had been noting its implications with the careful, unhurried pace she applied to all information she needed to assess accurately. The planning room was where she lived, in the functional sense of the word. Its walls were covered in the structural diagrams she drew in charcoal on the ice surface, the phases of the network mapped out in the precise, layered notation of a structural assessor who was also the architect of everything she was diagramming. The diagrams were large. They covered every wall from floor to ceiling in some sections. The room had the specific quality of a space that has been organized entirely around a single sustained project. Nothing decorative. Nothing extraneous, every element present because it was necessary. He stood in the doorway and looked at the walls. He looked for a long time without speaking, turning slowly to take in the full scope of what was diagrammed there, the original fortress and then the 4 phases beyond it. The network of connected structures extending across the northern territory in the specific geometric pattern that she had designed to follow the territory's natural frozen geography, using the existing ice and snowpack as both foundation and material. He said, "You were planning this before you built the first one." She said, "I have been planning it since I was 8 years old and understood what I could build." He said, "And the decree gave you the occasion." She said, "The decree gave me the location and the reason and the people." She looked at the diagrams. She said the plan existed. What it needed was permission to be real. He sat in the room's single chair. She stood, which was her preference when she was thinking, and she watched him sit with what she had said in the specific way he sat with things that required more than a single pass. She was used to his processing pace now. It was careful, which she respected. It was also slower than hers in certain registers and faster in others, which she had been mapping with the unsentimental interest she brought to all systems she needed to understand. He said, "I want to tell you what I intend to do about the council challenge before you name your terms. Because I want your terms to be based on what is actually available, rather than on what you believe I might offer if pressed." She said, "Go ahead." He told her. He told her plainly. In the direct language he had been developing over weeks of conversations in this room, without the diplomatic softening that official proposals typically carried. The challenge would be opposed on all 3 grounds. The statute's application to the fortress would be contested on constitutional grounds that his legal team had been building since the challenge was filed, and the decree would be formally repealed rather than merely suspended, with full restoration of housing rights and a formal mechanism for the 2 deaths in Verret to be officially acknowledged and recorded. She listened to all of it. She said, "And the registration statute." He said, "Repealed and replaced. The new framework will be voluntary, with protections rather than obligations." She said, "That requires council approval." He said, "I know." He said, "I have the votes. 3 council members who supported the challenge will not support the statute's continuation once the welfare data from the decree's impact is in the formal record, because their objection was strategic rather than principled, and the strategy has changed." She had not known he was counting votes. She revised her assessment of several things simultaneously. She said, "I want to tell you what I need. Not politically. What the people in this building need to be genuinely safe." She named it. She told him about the settlement's actual requirements, housing recognition, supply chain formalization, the legal standing of the residents who had no PAC affiliation and no kingdom documentation, the status of the territory itself. She told it with the plain, structural precision of someone naming load requirements, not negotiating, not asking for more than was necessary, naming exactly what the structure needed to stand. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I can give you all of that." She looked at him with the full, assessing attention she gave to things she needed to evaluate accurately. She said, "You have given things before and taken them back with a signature." He said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I am trying to build something I cannot take back. Something that holds because of its own structure, rather than because I am currently intending it to hold." She said, "Then build it the way I build things. From the grain. Not against it." He looked at her. He said, "Show me what that means." She took him to the wall. She crouched beside it. She whispered 3 words, and a new crystal formation grew from the surface, larger than the previous ones she had shown him. More complex, branching in 4 directions with the specific, organic logic of something that was growing according to its own internal geometry, rather than being shaped from outside. She said, "The grain is the truth of the material. You build with it or the structure fails. Not immediately, but eventually. Always." He said, in the quietest voice she had yet heard from him, "I think I have been building against the grain for a long time." She looked at him beside her at the wall, not performing any particular quality of attention. Simply being in the room with her at the level of the ice, which was where the real work happened. She was aware of the specific warmth of the fortress around them. The crystalline walls holding the interior temperature at something that was not cold despite every external condition suggesting it should be. And she thought about what she had built this from, and what she was currently in the process of allowing herself to consider building next. She said, "The grain of governance is people. The same principle applies." He said, "I am beginning to understand that." Outside the fortress, visible through the crystalline walls in the northern starlight, 2 signal fires appeared on the horizon. Then a third. She straightened immediately. She was at the wall panel before he had fully risen. 3 signal fires meant something specific and non-negotiable in the Northern Territory's warning system. And what they meant arrived in her understanding with the cold. Immediate clarity of information that does not wait for a convenient moment. "The border signal," she said. "Approaching threat." The signal fires meant what they always meant. Senna had grown up in the Northern Territory. She had learned the signal system at the same age she had learned to read. Not formally, not from a curriculum, but from the specific, practical education of a childhood spent in a landscape that communicated danger in fire and smoke, because fire and smoke were visible across 40 miles of frozen white where nothing else was. 3 fires in the northern configuration meant a significant raiding force. Moving fast. On an intercept vector. She was already in the main hall when Calder came down from the upper room behind her. She had the territory maps open on the central table. Not the network diagrams from the planning room, but the military survey maps she kept in the hall's document chest. The ones she had requested from the Northern Territory Administration 2 months before the decree, and had brought with her in her pack, because some instinct already understood that they would be necessary. Her military advisor arrived from the capital by dawn rider. His horse lathered from a pace that the road between the capital and the fortress did not usually accommodate in winter conditions. He spread his own maps beside hers without ceremony, and the 2 sets of cartography aligned with the specific, confirming precision of information from different sources arriving at the same conclusion. The raiding force was larger than last winter's, which had cost 47 lives and had moved through the northern flank, because the northern flank had nothing to stop it. The current vector would bring it directly past the fortress's position within 36 hours. Calder studied the maps with the focused, rapid attention of a military mind processing tactical information. His advisor traced the projected route with one finger. The fortress sat at exactly the point on that route where the terrain funneled movement, the natural elevation creating a choke point that, with adequate wall extension, would not merely anchor the northern defense line, but would make the route impassable. Senna was already measuring the extension in her mind, running the structural geometry, calculating the material requirements, assessing the terrain on the fortress's northern and eastern sides with the professional precision of someone who had walked that terrain for 7 years and knew its frozen topography, the way she knew the layout of a building she had assessed. The extension was possible. She had planned a version of it in phases 2 and 3 of the network diagram. The timeline was compressed by approximately 18 months, but the structure was not. The cost was the variable. 36 hours was 36 hours of continuous resonance work, not the 72 hours of the original construction, which had been distributed across building phases with natural intervals, but 36 hours of sustained extension under conditions that were more demanding because the pace was faster and the scope was larger and her body had not been given adequate recovery time since the original construction. She knew what it would cost. She ran the calculation with the honest precision she applied to all structural assessments and did not soften the conclusion. Calder looked up from the maps and found her already looking at him. He said in the quiet, direct voice he used when he was not performing anything, "I cannot ask you to do that." She looked at the 61 people in the hall around them, the settlement's residents who had come to the main hall when the signal fires were spotted, drawn by the specific, collective instinct of a community that had learned to move toward its center when the perimeter was threatened. She softened near the far wall, standing with 3 other young people, watching the maps with the focused attention of someone who was old enough to understand what signal fires meant and young enough that understanding it was still a physical experience rather than a managed one. She looked at Calder, She looked back at the maps. Without the kind of announcement that would have been inadequate to what she was about to do, she crossed to the fortress's northern wall. She crouched at its base. She pressed her palms against the ice. She leaned close. She began. The whisper that started the extension was different from the whisper that had started the original construction, not in its frequency, which was the same, but in its quality. The specific quality of a voice that is committing fully rather than beginning carefully, that has assessed the requirements and accepted them, and is no longer treating the cost as a variable to be managed. The ice under her palms responded immediately. The crystalline lattice engaging with the recognition of a material that had been waiting for this particular frequency for 2 days. Calder moved to where she was crouching and stopped 3 feet away. He did not attempt to speak to her. He understood, with the instinct of someone who had been learning how the work operated, that she was somewhere that conversation could not reach, and that attempting to reach it would be a disruption rather than a comfort. He stood at 3 feet, and he watched and he stayed. His military advisor began organizing the settlement's residents, moving people to the interior spaces, establishing a perimeter watch, sending riders with messages to the nearest kingdom installations. The hall organized itself around Senna's work with the specific efficiency of a community that understood what was happening and had decided, collectively and without discussion, that their role was to make the conditions for that work as sustainable as possible. Someone brought blankets and positioned them near her. Someone else built the hall fire higher. Finn carried a cup of heated water to within her reach and set it down without speaking, which was the right instinct and the right distance and the right silence. And Senna noted it through the work without breaking the whisper's rhythm. Outside the fortress, the extension began to grow. The extension grew through the night. It grew the way all things she built grew, not in the dramatic, sudden way of things that announced themselves, but with the specific, progressive certainty of something that is becoming rather than being assembled. Each crystal finding its position in the structure the way water finds its level, inevitably, completely, according to a logic so internal to the material that the result looked less like construction and more like revelation. By the 4th hour, the northern wall had extended 40 meters beyond the fortress's original perimeter. By the 8th, it had curved east along the terrain's natural contour, following the frozen ground's own geometry. The way she had told Calder all her structures followed the grain, not imposing form, but discovering it. The wall growing where the ice wanted to grow when directed correctly. By the 12th hour, the extension reached the first terrain anchor she had identified on the military maps. A frozen ridge that would anchor the wall's eastern end against lateral force with the structural efficiency of a natural buttress that no human architect could have designed as well, because no human architect had the time to grow into the landscape the way ice did. Calder did not sleep. He had taken up a position near the northern wall's base, close enough to watch, far enough not to interfere, and he maintained it with the specific, committed stillness of someone who has made a decision about where they are going to be and is not reconsidering it. His military advisor had suggested, at the 6th hour, that the king might reasonably retire to the interior and receive updates. Calder had looked at him with the expression that the advisor had learned, over 11 years of service, was the expression that meant the suggestion had been heard and would not be acted on. He watched the wall grow. He had been watching it for 12 hours, and he had not run out of attention for it, which told him something about the specific nature of what he was watching, that it was not the kind of thing that familiarity made ordinary, that each hour of the extension was as precise and as extraordinary as the first hour, that the work Senna was doing had the quality that all genuinely significant things had. The more closely you attended to it, the more it contained. He watched her face when he could see it, the profile of someone completely elsewhere, completely inside the work. The external world reduced to the tactile information of her hands on the ice, and the breath that carried the whisper and the temperature of the air against her skin. She was cold. The exterior conditions were 40 below, and she was working at the wall's base rather than in the fortress's warm interior. And the community had been rotating people to keep the fire close to her and the blankets on her shoulders without interrupting her, with a practiced attentiveness that told him they had worked out the protocol in the first hour. At hour 18, the raiding force reached the extension's eastern terminus. It did not breach. The force hit the wall with the specific, focused impact of an assault that had been expecting open ground and encountered instead a vertical surface of crystalline ice 2 stories high, running along the terrain without gap. Anchored at both ends by the frozen landscape's own structure. The wall rang, not like a struck stone, like a bell, a deep, sustained tone that moved through the fortress's entire structure, through Senna's hands and upper arms. A vibration she registered without breaking the whisper, because the wall was holding. The vibration was the sound of the force being distributed rather than concentrated. The crystalline geometry doing exactly what crystalline geometry did when it was properly formed and properly directed. The force tested the wall for 4 hours. It found no weakness, because the wall had no weakness of the kind that a rating force was equipped to exploit, no mortar joints, no pressure points, no places where the construction method had created structural compromise. It was ice grown along its own grain. And the only way to compromise ice grown along its own grain was to understand the grain, which required a relationship with the material that the force did not have. The force turned back at hour 22. At hour 30, Senna's whisper stopped. Not gradually. The way her voice ran out was not a fading, but a completion. The last crystal finding its position in the extension's terminus, the structure whole. The wall running from the fortress's northern face to the eastern terrain anchor in one unbroken crystalline line that would be, in the morning light, visible from the patrol points as a luminous edge against the frozen landscape. She was on her hands and knees in the snow at the wall's base. Her body had reached the specific, absolute limit of what 30 hours of continuous resonance work extracted from it, and the reaching of that limit had the quality of an arrival rather than a collapse, not failure but completion. The particular exhaustion of someone who has done everything the work required and has nothing left, not because something has been taken, but because everything has been given. Calder was beside her before he had consciously decided to move. The distance between his position and the wall's base crossed in seconds. Because some responses do not travel through the decision-making apparatus, but move directly from perception to action. And finding her on the ground in the snow after 30 hours of what he had been watching was that kind of perception. He crouched beside her. He did not ask if she was all right, because she was on her hands and knees in the snow, and the answer was not the point. He did not call for assistance, because the people who could provide it were already moving toward them, because the community had been watching as carefully as he had. He put his arms around her with the specific, careful urgency of someone who has been watching a person give 30 hours of everything they had and will not allow them to finish that act alone on the ground in the cold. He gathered her up, not quickly, not dramatically, with the deliberate care of someone who understands that what they are holding has just done something extraordinary and deserves to be handled accordingly. She did not wake. Her head fell against his shoulder with the total, unconscious weight of someone whose body has simply ceased to have any attention left for the surface world. He held her with both arms and stood, and the settlement's residents who had come to the wall cleared a path without being asked, because the community understood what had happened and what was required and had been. For 11 weeks, a community that understood things and acted on them without being asked. He carried her inside. The fortress closed around them, warm and crystalline and entirely present, holding everything it was built to hold. The capital had not seen a winter like this one in 40 years. Not in terms of temperature. The temperature was what it always was in the northern capital's winter. Cold and consistent and managed by the kingdom's administrative apparatus with the brisk efficiency of a system that had been doing this for a long time. In terms of what the winter contained. In terms of the specific quality of a season that had produced, in the span of 11 weeks, a fortress of crystalline ice in the northern wastes, a border defense that had turned back an incursion without a single casualty, and the formal suspension of a royal decree that had been defended by 3 senior council members as administratively sound until the welfare data made that defense professionally untenable. Senna arrived in the capital on a Thursday morning, 5 days after the border defense. She had recovered, not fully, because 30 hours of continuous resonance work did not produce a 5-day recovery, but adequately, which was the standard she applied to herself, and which Calder had spent 2 of the 5 days trying to expand without success. Her voice was rough at the edges in the specific way of an instrument that has been used at its full capacity for an extended period and is returning from that use, still present, still functional, still hers. She entered the throne room through the main doors. This was a choice she made deliberately, understanding its geometry the way she understood the geometry of all significant spaces. The main doors were the doors that announced arrivals worth announcing. The doors that said this person is here in full and intends to be received in full. The side entrance was for staff, for functionaries, for people whose presence was instrumental rather than primary. She had been instrumental in other people's spaces for the entirety of her adult life. She was not going to be instrumental in this one. The throne room was the most structurally sophisticated space in the capital. She had known this from Bren's specifications without having been in it, and she confirmed it in the first seconds of entering. The professional eye running automatically over the load-bearing elements, the arch geometry, the relationship between the ceiling height and the floor dimensions. It was good work. It was significantly less sophisticated than what she had built in 3 days in the northern wastes, which she noted without satisfaction and without the performance of modesty, simply as a structural fact. The court's attention arrived immediately and completely, which she had expected. She was aware of being seen, of the specific quality of a room that had been reading reports about her for 2 months and was now revising those reports against the actual thing. She did not adjust herself for the revision. She occupied her full space with the plain, unperformed quality of someone who has been in rooms that were trying to reduce her for most of her life and has spent 11 weeks building something so undeniably present that reduction has stopped being available as a category. Lord Harwick was at the council table. His legal team was arranged beside him with the professional composure of people who had prepared for a confrontation and were not certain what form the confrontation was going to take. Several council members who had supported the formal challenge were present, positioned with the careful neutrality of people who had assessed the direction of events and were managing their relationship to that direction. She stood at the center of the floor. She described what the decree had done, not abstractly, not in the administrative language of policy impact, but in the specific, documented terms of individual lives, the 160 people in the Ashfield North category whose survival outcomes the welfare assessment had described as not favorable, the 400 unaffiliated Omegas across the Northern Territory who had been legally homeless overnight in sub-zero winter, the 2 people in Verret whose names she had learned in the 5 days since the border defense because she had asked for them and had been given them, a woman named Marate and a man named Cole, both of whom had been 3 days' walk from the nearest unaffected settlement when the decree's enforcement date arrived. She named them aloud. In the throne room, before the full court assembly, she named them both. She described the fortress, not its architectural specifications, which Bren had already documented thoroughly, but its function as a living space, a community. A place where 61 people, who had been pushed out of the kingdom's administrative concern, were currently conducting their lives with the specific, purposeful dignity of people who have found somewhere to be. She described the border defense in the plain language of what had happened. A significant raiding force had reached the Northern Territory. The fortress extension had held the line, no one had died, and the extension had cost the woman who built it 30 hours of continuous work at the limit of her physical capacity. Harwick began his procedural response before she had fully finished, the professional reflex of a man who had been defending a position for 2 months and had constructed the defense thoroughly enough that he reached for it automatically. His lead counsel began a point of order. Calder stood. The specific quality of his standing, not the formal rise of a king conducting a session, but the complete, total arrival of a person who has decided that what is happening requires his full presence, produced the kind of silence that a room creates when it understands that what comes next is going to be significant and prepares itself accordingly. He looked at Harwick. Harwick's counsel did not finish the point of order. Calder looked at Senna. Across the full length of the throne room, in front of every person in the assembly, he looked at her with the full, specific attention that was simply how he was when something mattered to him entirely. The room was very still. He said, in the voice he used when he was not performing anything, "I have something to say to this court." He said, "What I have to say begins with what this court did to the people Senna just named, and it does not end until I have been completely honest about my role in it." Calder's speech was not what the court expected. The court had been expecting management, the specific, practiced register of a king navigating a difficult political situation with the combination of acknowledgement and redirection that 17 years of governance had made fluent. They had seen it before. They knew its shape. It acknowledged the difficult thing in terms general enough to be non-binding, redirected attention toward the corrective measures being implemented, and concluded with a forward-looking statement that turned the page without fully writing what was on it. What they received was something else. He began with the welfare assessment, not as an administrative document, as a choice. He described the specific moment in the council session when the decree had arrived for his signature. The 3-sentence summary, the 11-page assessment behind it that he had not read, the 4th hour of a 6-hour session. The pen moving across the signature line, and the next item on the agenda arriving before the ink was dry. He described this with the plain, unsparing directness of someone who has decided that the accurate account is the only account worth giving, and who understands that accuracy about one's own failures is more difficult and more necessary than accuracy about everything else. He said the word negligence, not the softer words available to him, oversight, administrative gap, procedural failure, the word that named the thing accurately. He said it clearly, without the hedging that would have made it less true or less his. The room was very still. Harwick had placed both hands flat on the table in front of him with the specific, careful deliberateness of a man choosing to manage his own response rather than produce it unmanaged. Calder named Marate and Cole. He said their names in the same way Senna had said them, not as data points, not as casualties in an administrative report, as people whose deaths were connected in a direct and documentable way to a signature he had provided without adequate attention to what it meant. He said their names and he did not move past them quickly, because moving past them quickly was the mechanism by which these names had never been in this room before today, and he was not going to employ that mechanism again. Then he turned to what Senna had built. He described the fortress with the precision of a man who had walked through it 3 times and had been paying the full quality of his attention on each occasion. He described the structural specifications not because the court needed the technical details, but because the technical details were the evidence, the most concrete and undeniable form of the argument he was making, which was that the kingdom had possessed, for 11 weeks, the most strategically significant fortification in the Northern Territory and had not built it, and that the woman who had built it had done so because he had signed a document that made her homeless in sub-zero winter. He named the border defense. He named what 30 hours of continuous work in 40 below conditions cost the person who performed it and what it had preserved for the kingdom in exchange. Not as a transaction, he was specific about this, but as evidence of a disparity that the kingdom could not continue to pretend it had not created. A woman had given 30 hours of her body to protect a northern border that his army had not been able to protect the previous winter. The kingdom had given her a housing eviction notice. He looked at Harwick. He said, without heat and without the performance of authority that made statements like this theatrical rather than true, the formal challenge is withdrawn. He said it as a statement of fact rather than a command, because what he had just said to the room made the challenge's continuation a structural impossibility in the specific way that things built against the grain eventually became impossible. Harwick looked at his hands. He did not look up. He announced the decree's formal repeal, not suspension, repeal, with full restoration of housing rights and a formal mechanism for the administrative acknowledgement of Marate and Cole's deaths as policy-produced harm, which had no precedent in the kingdom's legal record and which his legal team had spent 3 days constructing specifically because the absence of such a mechanism was itself a failure he intended to correct. He announced the formal recognition of the Northern Fortress as sovereign Omega territory, under a founding charter that he had written himself in the 5 days since the border defense, in the plain, specific language of a man who had been learning to build from the grain and was applying that learning to legal documents for the first time. The territory was not crown land. It was not kingdom property. It was its own, governed by its own charter, under the leadership of the person who had built it, with full legal standing in all kingdom proceedings and full autonomy in its internal governance. He gave the title he had created, no precedent, no template, simply the accurate description of what she was, sovereign architect of the Northern Territory. Full legal standing, full authority, formally recognized by the crown. Then he looked at Senna. She was standing at the center of the throne room floor. In the specific quality of stillness she carried when she was receiving something completely, not managing it, not deflecting, simply holding it at full weight and full reality. Her voice was still rough at the edges from 30 hours of work. She was 30 years old and had been building something since she was 8 and had just heard it, named aloud in a room that had not known how to name it until today. He said, "I am also asking you to chair the commission that will replace the unregistered gift use statute with a framework that protects rather than exploits. Because the person best qualified to build a structure that will hold is the person who understands what the grain requires." Harwick submitted a procedural objection. One sentence. Calder acknowledged it, entered it into the record, and overruled it in 4 words. Harwick did not submit a second. The vote was called. The formal recognition of the Northern Territory as sovereign, the decree's repeal. The Commission's establishment, 3 separate measures, voted on in sequence, each one carrying with the specific, inevitable momentum of things that have been built correctly and are therefore doing what correctly built things do. All 3 passed. Senna stood at the center of the throne room floor and received the votes with the stillness of someone who had built something in the frozen dark and waited to see what it would become, and was now seeing it and was allowing herself, privately and completely, to feel the full weight of what 11 weeks of whispered work had made real. The commission met for the first time on a Monday in the legal library. Senna had chosen the location with the same structural logic she applied to all spatial decisions. The legal library was where the kingdom's legislative record lived, which meant it was where the evidence lived. And the evidence was the foundation of everything she intended to build. The formal deliberation chamber with its high ceiling and its symbolic weight was a space designed to produce the impression of significance. She was interested in actual significance, which required different conditions. The commission had 7 members. She had specified the composition in her founding terms: 3 Omega-designated representatives, 2 independent legal scholars, 1 member of the Royal Administrative Staff, and Calder, who had requested a seat and whom she had included because she had assessed his contribution over the previous weeks and determined that it met the standard she was applying to all members, which was whether their presence would produce better outcomes than their absence. He had not pointed out that he was the king and was therefore not typically required to qualify for commissions he wished to join. She had not pointed out that she had noticed he had not pointed it out. They had simply proceeded, which was increasingly how they proceeded. The unregistered gift use statute had been 60 years in the kingdom's legal record, old enough to have accumulated a layer of administrative habit around it that had made it, over time, less a law than an assumption. People who worked in designation-adjacent administration referenced it without reading it. Enforcement had been inconsistent not because the statute was unclear, but because its application had become so normalized that it no longer required active decision-making. It simply existed, and its existence created a specific kind of pressure on every Omega gift holder in the kingdom. A constant low-grade awareness that what they were and what they could do belonged legally to a category of resource that the crown could claim. Senna had lived inside that pressure for 20 years. She understood its architecture from the inside. She presented the statute's full text to the commission in the first session and went through it, section by section, with the methodical precision of a structural assessor identifying load-bearing elements and failure points. The failure points were not obscure. They were visible from the outside to anyone who read the statute with the intention of understanding it rather than using it, which was how she suspected most of the people who had used it over 60 years had approached it, as a tool rather than as a text that described obligations. The replacement framework she had been drafting since the border defense had 4 core provisions. The first established that gift registration was voluntary, with no penalty for non-registration and no crown authority to compel assessment or documentation. A gift was the property of the person who possessed it, as completely and as legally as any physical property. And the voluntary choice to register it created rights and protections rather than obligations and claims. The second established the welfare framework for registered gifts, mandatory independent welfare assessment for any gift holder who chose to register, conducted at regular intervals. with the authority to impose conditions on any institutional use of a registered gift if the welfare assessment indicated that the use was causing harm. The conditions had teeth, which was the detail that had required the most negotiation with the Commission's administrative staff member, who was a thoughtful man named Reeve, and who had spent 2 sessions arguing that conditions without enforcement mechanisms were aspirational rather than legal. She had spent those same 2 sessions agreeing with him and building the enforcement mechanisms. They had arrived, by the end of the 2nd session, at a framework they both considered functional rather than merely hopeful. The 3rd provision abolished the Crown's authority to requisition an omega gift for pack or kingdom benefit without explicit, documented, renewable consent. Not implied consent. Not the administrative fiction of consent that the previous framework had generated by treating registration as agreement to use. Explicit consent, in writing, renewed annually, revocable at any time without consequence. The 4th provision was the one that had required the most careful construction and that she considered the most important, a formal acknowledgement, written into the statute's replacement as a founding principle rather than a footnote, that the kingdom's history under the previous framework had produced documented harm, and that the replacement framework existed not as a neutral policy shift, but as a specific correction of a specific wrong. She had written this section herself, in the plain, direct language she used when plain and direct were the only honest options, and had brought it to the Commission without apology for its lack of administrative neutrality. The Commission had debated it. 2 members had suggested softer language. She had listened to both suggestions with the genuine attention she gave to all input she needed to evaluate honestly, and had then explained, with the methodical patience of someone who has thought about this for 20 years, why the softer language was structurally weaker, why a provision that acknowledged harm vaguely would be interpreted vaguely, and why a provision that named the harm specifically would be defended specifically. The Commission had agreed. The language had stayed. Through the 3 months of the Commission's work, the Fortress network grew. Phases 2 and 3 advanced simultaneously, the 2nd fortress rising 80 miles northeast of the original. The 3rd in the western arm of the Northern Territory's natural geography. Both were built with the same structural principles as the first, from the grain, following the ice's own direction. Warm inside despite all external conditions suggesting they should not be. Each became a community before it was fully complete, because word traveled through the Northern Territory's displaced population with the specific speed of information that people have been waiting for. Calder visited the Northern Territory monthly. He had developed, over the months of the Commission's work and the network's expansion, a practical understanding of glacial resonance that was not a gift but was something adjacent to one, not the ability to direct the ice, but the ability to read it, to see in a formed crystalline structure what the formation had required and what it had cost and what it was doing. The way a person who has spent enough time with music can hear the effort in a performance even without being able to perform themselves. He stood at the walls Senna built and understood them. Not completely. More than before. The gift registration framework passed the Council on a Wednesday afternoon in the Commission's 4th month. 6 votes in favor, 1 abstention from Harwick, who had developed over the months a specific quality of silence in Commission sessions that Senna had come to read as the silence of a man who had not changed his foundational position but had run out of defensible arguments for it, and was managing the situation by saying nothing rather than saying something he would need to retract. She was alone in the legal library that evening. The Commission had ended, the Council had voted. The members had gathered their documents and filed out with the specific, slightly dazed quality of people who have been doing intensive work for 4 months and have just arrived at its conclusion. She sat at the long table with the final text of the framework in front of her and the legal library's particular quality of accumulated silence around her. She thought about her father on the road north, the cart, the autumn light. Never build anything that beautiful again. Not where anyone can see it. She thought about 20 years of small, private, dismantled constructions. She thought about the notebook she had kept since she was 8, the pages of structural diagrams that had been plans rather than memories, blueprints for things she was going to build when the conditions were different. The conditions were different. She had made them different. 12 weeks in the northern wastes, 30 hours at a wall base. For months at a commission table, the same building process applied to different materials. Ice and law, crystal and statute, all of it from the grain, all of it held. She put the framework in the commission's formal record and closed the file. She looked at the legal library around her, the 400 years of the kingdom's written law, the accumulated record of everything the kingdom had decided was true, the text from which the laws that had failed her had come, and into which the laws she had written were now entered. She picked up her pen. She wrote one line in her private notebook, not a structural diagram, not a building plan. A sentence. It said, "The grain holds." She closed the notebook. She went north. 2 years after the Winter Court decree, the Northern Territory had 5 fortresses. Senna knew their precise dimensions the way she knew the dimensions of her own hands, not because she reviewed the specifications regularly, but because she had built them, which meant they lived in her body as much as they lived in the landscape. The first fortress at the natural elevation 9 miles north of Ashfield, the second 80 miles northeast. Anchored against the frozen ridge, she had identified in the military survey maps as the Eastern Defense Anchor. The third in the western arm, positioned at the territory's natural weather break. The fourth and fifth smaller, transitional structures connecting the network into the continuous system she had designed in the planning room's charcoal diagrams. The phases 2 through 5 plan that she had been working toward since she was 8 years old and had understood what she could build. The network housed 631 people. Every one of them had chosen to come, which was the detail she considered most significant, not the structural specifications, not the military value, not the administrative recognition, but the specific fact that 631 people had made a deliberate choice to be in a place that had been built specifically to hold them. The choosing was the foundation. Everything else was the structure above it. The Equal Resonance Council held its monthly session in the main hall of the original fortress on the first Tuesday of every month. 12 members, 6 Alpha designated, 6 Omega designated, full voting standing for all. The session record maintained in the same crystalline precision Senna brought to all documentation that mattered. Fan sat on it. She was 16 now, the youngest council member in the Northern Territory's history. And she had been present for every session since the council's founding with the focused, absorptive attention of someone who was learning a thing she intended to do for a long time. She argued clearly and listened completely and changed her position when the evidence warranted it, which was the standard Senna applied and which she had watched Fan develop over 18 months of sessions without telling her she was watching, because the watching was unnecessary to say. The gift registration framework had enrolled 407 Omega gift holders across the kingdom in 2 years. Every enrollment was voluntary. Every enrolled gift holder had full welfare assessment coverage and full legal standing in any proceeding affecting their gift's use. Not one had been compelled. Not one had been registered against their will. The framework's founding principle, the acknowledgement of historical harm, written in plain language rather than administrative softening, had been cited in 11 subsequent legal proceedings, each time as the basis for a ruling that extended protection to a situation the framework had not specifically anticipated, but whose logic it had established clearly enough that extension was natural rather than contested. 7 pieces of legislation had been returned for welfare review under the assessment provision before reaching the throne for signature. 7 times. A document had been examined for its impact on Omega-designated populations before it became law rather than after. 7 times. Harm that would have been written into the kingdom's legal record had been written out of it before it arrived. She stood at the original fortress window on a morning in early winter. 2 years after the night, she had walked past the last lamp post and pressed her palms against the frozen ground and leaned close. The window faced north. It always faced north in all the structures she built, because north was where the work was and where she came from and where the ice was most honest. The winter light came through the crystalline wall at the angle that crystalline walls produced it, organized and luminous. The specific quality of light that had passed through something precisely made and arrived on the other side cleaner than it had been before. Below, in the settlement's courtyard, the morning was conducting its business. People moving between the buildings on the paths she had shaped into the network's connective tissue. Not roads, not corridors, but something between the two. Covered by crystalline arches that protected the paths from the exterior, whether while transmitting the northern light in the specific amber and blue-white spectrum of perfectly formed ice in winter sun. Children were visible near the eastern wall. A group of adults was gathered outside the council hall, deep in a conversation that had the specific quality of useful disagreement. Ren, who had come north 3 months after the original fortress's founding and had never gone back to the capital's archive, was in the network's document library, a space Senna had designed specifically around the requirements of someone who understood what documents needed, and which Ren had immediately reorganized upon arrival in a way that was more functional than Senna's original specification, which Senna had acknowledged without comment and then incorporated into Phases 4 and 5's library designs. She heard footsteps in the corridor that she recognized before they arrived, the specific, deliberate cadence she had been learning for 2 years with the unsentimental attention she gave to all things she considered worth understanding completely. He appeared in the doorway without announcement, which was simply how he arrived now, not because protocol had been abandoned, but because protocol had been replaced by something more accurate to what was actually happening between them, which was a relationship that had grown in the specific way her structures grew, from the grain, following the direction the material wanted to go, not imposed but discovered. He came to stand beside her at the window. He looked at the settlement below with the quality of attention that she had, over 2 years, come to understand as his most honest register, the focused, complete attention of someone who was looking at something that mattered to him and was not managing his relationship to that mattering. He said, "Bren finished the structural analysis of the third fortress. He wants to know if you will review it before he presents it to the engineering council." She looked at the courtyard below. A group of the settlement's youngest residents had gathered near the eastern wall, 7 children between the ages of 6 and 12, involved in a project that from this distance appeared to involve a great deal of focused discussion and a great deal of snow. One of the children crouched. She watched the child lean close to the snow at the wall's base and press both small hands against it. The child's lips moved. The snow responded. A small formation rose from the surface, imprecise, the way children's first constructions always were, not yet finding the grain with the confidence that came from practice and years and the specific accumulation of a relationship with the material, but responding, the material answering the asking. The child looked up at what she had made with the specific expression of a 6-year-old who has just discovered something about herself that is going to determine how she spends a significant portion of her life. Senna looked at the child. She thought about a frozen puddle outside a schoolhouse, and a whisper, and a small perfect tower that had caught the morning light and been knocked over with a boot before anyone else could see it. She thought about 20 years of small, private, dismantled constructions. She thought about what it would have meant to be that 6-year-old and have someone tell her, "Keep going. Do not knock it over. Let it stand." She looked at Calder beside her. He was watching the child too, with the expression she had learned to read as the expression of a man who was receiving something he had not expected and was not going to pretend he had. She took his hand, not with the careful, provisional quality of the earlier months, but completely. The way she did things she had decided were worth doing at full commitment, without reservation, without the managed distance she had spent 20 years maintaining between herself and anything she could not afford to lose. She had decided, at some point that she could not precisely locate on a timeline, but that felt like it had been accumulating for a long time before it arrived, that this was worth the full commitment. He held her hand with the same completeness, with the specific quality of someone who had learned, over 2 years of building from the grain, that the grain of this particular thing was worth following wherever it went. Below, the child was building something else now, larger than the first attempt, still imprecise, still responding. The small hands pressed against the snow, and the lips moved, and the material answered. Because the material always answered when the asking was honest. Calder said quietly, "There is something I have been wanting to tell you. About the next phase of the Northern Territory Charter. About what I think it should contain." She looked at him. She said, "Tell me." He said, "I think it should contain something we have not written yet. A provision we have been building toward without putting into the formal record." She looked at the courtyard, at the child and the responding snow, at the 631 people conducting their lives in the structures she had built from the truth of the material. She looked north, where the border that 30 hours of her voice had defended was still standing, still holding, still crystalline and precise and warm inside despite every external condition suggesting otherwise. She knew what provision he meant. She had known for some time. She had been waiting for the right moment, which she had come to understand was not a moment she could design in advance, but one that would arrive when the structure was ready for it, when the grain pointed clearly in the direction it wanted to go. The grain was pointing. She said, "Write it. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues." If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.